Hello and welcome to our webinar today on Next Generation 911 funding. My name is Danita Welch. I'm going to be moderating today and be one of your panelists. We're going to start with some introductions so folks know who else is here. Let's go to the next slide. I'm pleased to introduce a couple of colleagues from the Ministry of Citizen Services. We have Yvonne Ricon and Vera Chen with us today, and they'll be available to answer any questions as we get to the Q&A portion. Also, I'd like to introduce Bar Sahota, who is a Senior Policy Analyst with UBCM and is also here to answer questions when we get to the Q&A. Before we get started with the presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I'm fortunate enough to be joining today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, represented today by the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I just like to offer my personal appreciation for the ability to live, work, and raise my family in this territory. A couple of housekeeping points, sort of webinar process points before we move into the presentation itself. We will be using the Q&A function. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You're welcome to add your questions there. We will have plenty of time for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to enter questions at any time, and they'll just be queued up for us to answer at the end. The chat function is disabled for panelists, so you will not, the chat function is disabled for participants. So if you're here viewing the webinar, you will not be able to use the chat. So please do remember to add any of your questions under the Q&A. And if for any reason the Q&A is not working for you, you can raise your hand. That button's also at the bottom, and we will be able to unmute your microphone when we get to the Q&A, and you could ask a question verbally. But if at all possible, please do start with the Q&A function so we can keep all the questions in one spot. As you'll see, we're going to look at the background, the intent, review the funding streams, talk about timelines and process in terms of how this money is going to get out the door, and then we'll move to the Q&As after that. So for background, some of you may have seen the press releases, news releases that came out last February. So funding was announced, a total of $150 million was announced. 60 million came to UBCM, and that's the funding we're going to be talking about today, and how that money is going to be divided up for local governments and Treaty First Nations in the province. But the other 90 million went to ECOM, and so that is to assist with implementation costs on behalf of the agencies that ECOM already provides call taking or dispatching services for. We're not going to be covering any portion of that in the webinar today, but certainly there are folks at ECOM that would be happy to answer any questions around that offline from this webinar. So what's the intent of the funding? Well, it's written out here, and I'm not just going to read it to you, but instead I'll just sort of let you know that the intent is twofold. So, and we're going to get into this when we talk more about how the funding's been carved up, but it's to support local preparedness. The shift to Next Gen 911 is significant. It's going to significantly change how the 911 service works. And there will be the need for every community in our province to be prepared for that transition. The second piece of the funding is in relation to compliance. So this is a CRTC mandate, a federal transition to Next Gen 911. And a portion of the funding is being made available to those communities in BC that run either call answer or dispatch services and have the requirement to meet, to be compliant with the CRTC mandate and all the technical requirements that come with that before the implementation date. So the funding streams. This is being run really different than a lot of the funding programs we run at UBCM. I think it's fair to say this came to us somewhat differently in that it was announced and then we started working on program design after. It's not typically how we manage our funding programs. We knew we needed to do something somewhat different for the Next Gen 911 funding. And so what we have established is a program that is going to operate at least in the first 4 funding streams on an allocation basis. So what does that mean? it means there's no funding applications. Nobody has to apply for this money under these first 4 funding streams. And instead, when we talk process later, I'll give all the details of what that's going to look like. But essentially, every community is going to be receiving a letter that indicates what you've been approved for. And the program guide then provides all the information on what's eligible for each level of funding. So under the allocation, there are 4 funding streams. We're going to talk about them in a bit more detail for each one divided up. But the plan is to release this portion of the money that you can see on the screen, these 4 funding streams, as an allocation to the first category. The base funding will go to every local government and Treaty First Nation in the province. And then the balance will be for those communities, as I already mentioned, that run call answer or dispatch. To the next slide then, let's talk more about base funding. So as I already said, every local government and every Treaty First Nation will receive $45,000. Just to clarify that under local governments, the Islands Trust and the Atlan Community Improvement District are included. The focus on this money is for local preparedness. So as we already discussed, it's a significant transition. NextGen 911 is going to support capacities that haven't previously existed. And for some communities, there's going to be the need for some specific training and increased understanding about how that will look. So what's eligible for funding? In all cases, refer to table 1 of the program guide, which has all of the specific details. But the general buckets we're looking to fund under the base funding is public education, legal and contract costs, mapping and GIS, and training and the development of training materials. So a little bit more detail on those. Some of the things we've heard from some communities that we've spoken to around public education. One example is for resort municipalities or communities that are, known to be tourist destinations. You might need some local marketing for visitors to your community around how 911 works and will work as the phases roll in. Some other examples we've heard is communities that tend to have migrant workers who have seasonal populations. There might be some tailored public education there. And then just general public education. So community members understand the transition and what functionality of NextGen 911 is available and at what time. Legal and contract costs, I mean, we're primarily thinking about the costs that communities have in contracting call answer and dispatch services, whether that's with ECOM or with some of the secondary PSAPs that are doing call answer for at least for fire dispatch in the province. There is probably the requirement for a lot of folks to be reviewing, re-signing contract costs that might come with some legal costs. So we wanted to make sure that there was money there to cover that. Mapping in GIS is a bit of a quandary. It's a big issue. Certainly, any questions that come up in relation to that, I'll defer to our colleagues at Citizen Services. But moving to some of the new functionality of NextGen 911 means we need much better mapping and GIS support. So money available there for communities to spend money as needed on that bucket. And the last one, training and development of training materials. Some things that came up that in communities we've spoken to is specific training for local fire departments, for search and rescue, specific training that might need to be undertaken in communities, training for elected officials, training for local government staff. All of those are eligible for funding, as well as the development of local training materials that you might need to undertake the training sessions. Let's look then to the primary PSAPs. So there's only 2 in BC. So these are public service answering points, PSAPs. These are the communities that are operating a 911 system outside of ECOM. So in BC, that's limited to Nelson and Prince Rupert. So those 2 communities will also be receiving, in addition to the base funding, $3.5 million. And this is where the focus starts to shift to compliance. So this is when we're getting into all the technical requirements that communities will need to meet in order for NextGen 911 to function in their communities. So the eligible activities, again, please refer to the table in the program guide, but here we're starting to look at, call handling solutions and devices, governance, and then we defer to what's eligible for the secondary PSAPs, because we are funding the same kind of technological investments and other pieces as we are for the primary and the secondary. So under this bucket, as I said, it's just Prince Rupert and Nelson that are eligible or that are recipients. But to the secondary PSAPs, our next slide. So there's 6 communities here that will receive funding for interest's sake. That's Surrey, the Comox Valley Regional District, which is the administrator for what's known as North Island 911. Kelowna, Fraser Fort George Regional District, Burnaby, and Kamloops are the eligible recipients here, eligible for $3 million each. Again, this is the focus on compliance. And this is where you see the longer list of what's eligible. And the activities listed here under bullet 3 are also what the primary PSAPs are eligible to apply for. So purchase and installation of hardware and software. The program guide has a lot of very specific examples of what's eligible. So please refer to that. General change management, this is a big shift for these organizations that are running primary and secondary PSAPs, and change management training or support is something that we're very much expecting communities to want to spend money on. Business continuity, so ensuring that as we transition from the old system to the new, that the 911 systems are running efficiently. Again, training, mapping, and GIS, legal and contract costs, we already spoke about. Collaboration with Indigenous communities, wanting to be sure that some of the challenges that we've heard around traditional place names, and then some of the issues around getting adequate mapping, kind of across tenures and across administrative boundaries, is something that we're happy to consider funding for. And then governance for secondary PSAP. So that's looking specifically about how the PSAP governs itself. It's not intended to be looking at the broader governance of the 911 system in BC, but about how that individual PSAP is governing itself. And so that's the intent of that last bullet there. There's a final bucket under the allocation, which is for 1 secondary PSAP in the province, and then 4 municipally run RCMP operations communication centers. So these are entities that will have some of their costs covered by ECOM, because they do work with ECOM for their service provision, but they won't have all their costs provided by ECOM. And so what you'll see in this list is a lot of similarities to the previous list, minus the majority of the hardware and software. And so for clarity's sake, the 1 PSAP referenced here is Saanich, and the 4 municipally run RCMP OCCs are Surrey, Coquitlam, City of Langley, and the City of North Vancouver. So like I said, it's the same cost, and it's minus the technological investments, and generally looking to support kind of the softer costs, the change management, business continuity, the training. So that's the intent of this bucket. It's limited to $500,000 in addition to the base funding for each of these communities. Next slide. So the combined allocation, and since it's a $60 million fund, the combined allocations that we're talking about fall just shy of, it's about just shy of, just a little bit more than $36.5 million out of the $60 million pot. The balance of the money we are holding on to for a future application-based program. This is a program that was, honestly, somewhat difficult to develop because the goalposts are still somewhat moving in terms of the implementation of NextGen 911. Certainly COVID postponed the original intended implementation date. And some of the phases that will come online, real-time texting, for example, and then moving forward to videos, images, etc., being able to upload it or share it through the 911 system. It's hard for communities to estimate what those things will cost when we don't know necessarily all of the technical specifications or cost, local cost estimates that will go into that. One example we've heard sort of loud and clear is, how much cloud space are we going to need to be able to store images and videos versus what we needed when we were running more of an analog audio-based system. And so we wanted to hold some money. So we're going to be running an application-based program in 2025. More details will be available in early 2025. And that will be to help communities that have had costs that this initial allocation wasn't able to cover, or as communities become more mature and they're thinking about what some of the future phases might look like, especially those communities running the primary and secondary PSAPs and the OCCs, who have more technical requirements to meet. Anything that sort of the initial allocation-based funding was not able to cover would be considered under the application-based program in the future. So it's intentional that we're holding back money. We want to make sure that there is additional funding available as the system comes online and communities start incurring costs for some of the later phases. Next slide. So into the timeline and process. So as I already spoke to, the application-based funds, there are no funding applications. There is no application form. Every local government and every Treaty First Nation in the province will be receiving an approval agreement, which will identify the funding they've been approved for. The majority of local governments and Treaty First Nations in the province will be approved for base funding only. I've identified the communities that will be eligible for the additional dollars based on their operations of primary PSAPs, secondary PSAPs, and OCCs. So the majority of you will be seeing letters that identify that your community is the eligible recipient of $45,000 in base funding. Those approval agreements will start to go out this week. My team here, we've drafted the majority of the letters, so we're able to send them out. For those of you that are familiar with the funding programs we administer, it will be in the form of an approval agreement. It'll set out the terms and conditions of the grant. And excuse me, sorry. Excuse me, we would ask that the CAO or nation manager countersign those agreements and return them to UBCM. After they've been received, the signed versions of the agreements, after they're received, UBCM will release 50% of the eligible grant. And then that will go out to the communities. Letters are going to go out starting this week into next week. We do have 200 plus letters to write, so bear with us. It will take us a little bit of time to get them all out the door. We're expecting the payments then to follow kind of through August and September. The balance of the grant will be eligible to be paid upon receipt of interim or final reporting. So we do have an interim report process for all of our funding programs. It's a form that you just need to fill out. Let us know, how much you've spent, what activities you've completed, and then we can release additional dollars. Generally speaking, we don't release more than 75% of the total value of the grant. We always do keep a holdback until we've received the final report. The final report form is not posted yet, but it will be shortly. I'm hoping to have that up by the end of the month. But the interim report form is there. We've carved out a 3-year window for eligible expenses, much longer than the majority of our funding programs. But again, it's to recognize the rollout, the intended rollout of the phases of the Next Gen 911 program, again, at a national level, not unique to BC. And so that communities, especially communities who are receiving the base funding, have some money, have the ability to spend money as the new phases roll out, and they might want to introduce new levels of public education or new levels of training in their communities. As I already spoke to, the application-based program will follow in 2025. My hope is to have that program guide available sort of in the winter, early months of 2025, with an application deadline likely in June or potentially in the fall of 2025. So I'm going to pause there, and maybe before we move on to questions, just turn it over to the other panelists we have here to see if there's any key points, anything anybody would like to add about the funding that UBCM is administering, and then we'll turn to Q&A.
Danita, yeah, if I may, I want to make a couple of additional comments based on your presentation. And thank you for taking care of this. As you said, it was a little bit unusual. And for those of us who follow the process since it was first kind of start working within government, it was a rush to get this out the door. And thank you, UBCM, for the support. The couple of comments that I wanted to make before we go into Q&A is, the first one is a very common question that we have received while the program was announced, is the fact that these are costs allocated to the transition itself and not the operation of 911 systems, right? So I think at some point in the guide is actually written down that there's no operational costs that will be funded by this. And the reason is that there are other efforts within government to deal with the operational costs moving forward. We can't really say at this point what they're going to look like, because there is a process behind that. There are some ideas based on what is happening in other jurisdictions across Canada, but this funding is not for operational costs, and that's something that has to be very clear from day one. The second comment is that, as you see in the different buckets that we designed with UBCM, really what we're trying to do is to support the transition itself. And some of the other questions that we receive is that between now and 2025, there are things that need to happen within the current 911 systems. And unfortunately, these funds are for transition and not for taking care of those, let's call it, legacy systems. So yeah, that's another piece of 911 operations that cannot be funded. Is the kind of the ongoing or the existing support for 911 systems, right? So those are two questions that we have received quite a few times. So I wanted to address those before we move into the Q&A.
And maybe I'll just follow up on that, just to say that's a really good point. So the program guide does identify actually 3 ineligible expenditures. So one is operational costs related to current or future 911 call answer or dispatch. The second is any costs related to any activity being funded by ECOM, the RCMP, or the BC Emergency Health Services. So if you are in a community like the OCCs, like Saanich, where some costs will be covered by ECOM and some under this grant, and unfortunately it's not 100% crystal clear in some cases where some activities will be funded and where others will. So if you are in a situation where you end up having costs covered by any of those other agencies, then they do become ineligible under this funding. And the last to point out is this grant is not intended to be for major capital improvements. We're not rebuilding call centers or dispatch rooms. Some minor amendments in relation to new technology are being considered, but no major capital improvements or major renovations will be considered under this funding. So just to follow up on Yvonne's points there, that is on page 5 of the program guide, if anybody wanted to find some more detail there. Any other panelists wanted to add anything before I see we do have 8 questions queued up. All right, well, then I'm going to move to the questions. Okay, so the first question is funding eligibility limited to modern Treaty First Nations or all First Nations? So it is limited to modern Treaty First Nations. If you refer to, I'm going to bring the program guide in front of me here. Page number stopped. The very last page of the program guide, which identifies the other eligible recipients outside of incorporated local governments in the province. You'll see which Treaty First Nations are included and will be receiving funding. Okay, can municipalities give their share of the 45,000 to their regional district if the regional district coordinates 911 on behalf of other member municipalities and does the GIS mapping? So, I mean, certainly with all of our grants, we trust that local governments procure the services as they need to procure them. So if you already have a relationship where you're paying another entity, be that another local government, to provide the service, you can do so, but it needs to be really clear, as Yvonne already spoke to, this is about costs in relation to transition to Next Gen 911. It's not about your routine operating costs. So you just have to be really clear that any services you procure are clearly limited to the transition to Next Gen 911 and not sort of any ongoing routine operational costs you might already have through contracts.
If I may add something here, Danita, we know, in fact, that in some North Island 911 is a great example. So there are entities that currently do that on behalf of others, regional district and municipalities. So as Danita is saying, indeed, pooling resources to kind of fulfill some of these transition mandates is totally accepted because that's the way it is, right? So it was really difficult for us to make a decision ourselves to allocate money to those bigger entities and not to the municipalities or anything like that. So that's why we decided to go to the municipal level and then let the municipalities decide what's the best way to use the money as it refers to the transition costs.
Next question we have is any funding being provided to First Nations? So for the funding being administered by UBCM, the agreement that we have signed with the Ministry of Citizen Services limits the funding to local governments and Treaty First Nations, as we've discussed, modern Treaty First Nations. Yvonne, I don't know if you could provide any further update on any other funding that might be available to First Nation communities.
Yeah, so there are other programs around government that actually fulfill some of the, I'm going to say the same objectives, but they do have similar intent to fund First Nations activities, including elements of emergency management, public safety, and the like, right? So the complexity around 911 services is that this is a very specific ecosystem of parties doing this, right? So, for example, we found already a situation of a First Nation that has its own fire services. So in those situations, those fire services, of course, if they have a 911 system or a 911 relationship with a 911 system, then yeah, costs that will be allocated to anything there will be funded. Is more likely things that will come after, as Danita was saying, that we couldn't catch in the first batch of funding, and that's the reason why we have the application based. But certainly, as things move forward, we know that there's some First Nations and Indigenous groups that are interested in setting up services that we would call like 911 services, but that's something that down the road we'll have to decide, right? So we really had to limit to what we currently have and the currently relations and the currently elements of the system, and that's what was funded.
Thank you, Yvonne. The next question is very long. So with respect to the base funding, was there any consideration given to the fact that in BC, it is primarily regional districts that are being asked to sign the local government services agreements with TELUS, which makes regional districts responsible for delivering all of the mapping for their member municipalities and First Nations to TELUS. So I'm going to pause there because the answer is kind of the same. The question keeps going, but I'm just going to pause there. The answer is the same that we've already given, that member municipalities can decide to, allocate their portion of the 45,000 to the regional district under eligible sort of mapping and GIS costs, again, in relation to the transition to NextGen 911, not in relation to routine operations of 911. So in that sense, yes, it was considered. We do understand that regional districts are primarily the ones who sign the agreements, and members within regional districts can certainly allocate funding in that direction. The question continues, the regional districts are the ones that are going to face the legal costs with renewing agreements with ECOM or secondary PSAPs and with their member municipalities to deliver their mapping. I believe that is generally the service of the regional districts to provide 911 for member municipalities. Thus, the educational piece will likely fall to RDs as well, not to the member municipalities. I know there are exceptions to this in BC.
Yeah, I can add a little bit as well, Danita. When this process began, and as I understand it, Yvonne, you may have more to add, but when this process began, it was supposed to be municipalities and regional districts signing the service agreements. And at some point, the process has shifted to regional districts. And I know we are working on that, but just wanted to note that when the process began, it was municipalities and regional districts that were being asked to sign the service agreements.
Yes, and the next layer of complexity, Bar, is the fact that you go back to legislation, the current legislation, and the few pieces of regulation that may be applied to 911 services in BC, and that's one of the reasons why the government is also working in other initiatives around that. It actually states that public safety, including 911 services, are a municipal responsibility, right? So the fact that we in BC have kind of organically organized throughout the years, for the last 30 years, to the point where regional districts fulfill some of these things is almost like relationships and not necessarily specific mandates, right? So all those layers, when we start to peel them off, we really went down to the fact that we had to go down to the municipal level to make sure that we didn't miss anything, because it would have been easier just to say, okay, well, let's go to the regional districts and get this money, right? But as the question itself states, yeah, there are some exceptions where there are municipalities that actually do some of this work. And in some cases, municipalities also offer services to other municipalities. So, I mean, when you put all those things together, we really had to go to the lower common denominator to make sure that everybody had the money. But as Danita already said, and we have said before in this presentation, there's nothing preventing the municipalities to go back and pool the resources. And again, one great example is Northern Island 911 services, because they know that they operate like that. So they came back to us and say, like, yeah, sure. I mean, we don't have any problem going back to our municipalities and the regional districts that conform our society, and just ask them to pool the resources and bring whatever we need to bring into the transition, right? So it is. Yeah, we don't have a perfect system to either operate or allocate funding here. So we have to go with that lower common denominator, which is the municipalities.
Thanks, Bar and Yvonne, for helping me with that one. The next one's also about challenges that face regional districts, but this one's getting a bit more into the concept of data aggregators. So I'm going to read the question and then probably immediately defer to Yvonne to answer it. But I guess this is also a very long question. So one of the challenges at the regional district level is that we are being asked by TELUS to take contractual responsibility as data aggregator and PSAP operators for all areas within our boundaries, while not having legislative authority that would allow us to fulfill these obligations for the areas governed by municipalities and Indigenous communities included in these areas. This creates challenges in cases where these organizations already have independent agreements and data processing workflows with their secondary PSAPs, and in many cases do not have the capacity to deliver their own GIS projects. I'm not sure if this is relevant to the granting program, but it does represent a risk to RDs and possibly 911 in general.
So thank you, Danita, for deferring that to me, because the answer is
Very well.
Yes, it is a risk, but it's a risk that we feel is manageable, at least from the funding perspective, right? So there are other components to this question and this statement, actually, because this is not a question, it's more like a statement, because we know this is happening, and those elements are around legislative and regulatory powers that at some point we have to have. So again, there are some initiatives, as I said before, that are pointing to this very specific issue. But with the imperfect system that we have today, the best we can do is to say, okay, well, let's manage that risk, giving the money to the municipalities so they can pool the money, go to the regional district or whoever is asked to sign the agreements and accept those responsibilities in a way and getting to the point of fulfilling the commitments made in those agreements, right? So we don't think that that's not manageable. Quite the contrary, I think that if you look at, this is what I work in risk management. So you look at the uncertainty of how this is going to look within the next 3 years, at least we have some element here, in this case, the money, to start working and not just kind of freezing and waiting for something to happen, which probably is not going to happen soon, because if this is linked to legislative and regulatory situations, it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? So we are thinking about how to properly manage this, and this is the best way that we could find so far.
Thank you. The next question is not a question, it's a comment. So the interim report form link is not working in the program guide. So if you look at the chat, Claudia has been kind enough to post a link that does work, and we will update the guide right after this webinar and make sure that the link is working. Okay, moving on. So my community is not a PSAP. What do you think training for fire departments might look like? Our service is regional and equipment is provided by our regional districts. Unclear on this. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on what fire departments might need to do for training. You know, one call I had when we were working with some of the PSAPs, you know, one suggestion was that just sort of making sure, you know, the radios in the fire trucks are still connected to the system, and making sure everybody understands that as NextGen 911 goes live, what that means for your own local communication systems and how those link to the broader system. I don't know more specifically. Yvonne, I don't know if you have any suggestions on what local fire department training might look like.
Yeah, I mean, NextGen 911 is really a different approach to offering services for citizens dialing or calling 911. So it is expected that it's going to have a downstream effect into the 911 service providers, fire departments, and others. So it is, again, part of what had been discussed in some of the forums out there, that there will be some requirements, especially because, for example, the smaller fire departments, they are volunteer based. So they know their stuff on the fire thing, but dealing with the new technology may be more complicated than some people think. It may not be, but for some people it may. So that's the kind of thing that we need to do, right? It's not different to when you get a new system and somebody has to come and explain to you how it works and the kind of things that you will see and the kind of things that you will hear and the differences between doing this in this system versus doing that in the next system. So those kind of things are going to affect everyone involved in the 911 ecosystem. And that's the kind of thing that the base funding should be able to address.
I mean, one thing just to kind of add further to that is that, you know, I do recall a conversation of just sort of broadly having, you know, some people in your community, like your volunteer firefighters, maybe your volunteer search and rescue folks, being able to be sort of ambassadors to what the new system works, kind of local subject matter experts who can be there for the other type of public education they might already be doing, or other interactions they might already have with the public, to also be sharing knowledge and information about how the system works, especially as new phases to the system roll in. So that was another piece that actually did come up in one of our conversations. Okay, back to mapping. Can you share more information about what mapping and GIS requirements will be? Are there data standards that each municipality needs to align to?
Yeah, I can take that one, and the answer is yes, there are data standards. So there is an organization called NINA. I'm going to put the link in, I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to put the link. So internally, UVCM has it and can share it in different ways. But there are standards. They're very, very technical. So this is not something that if you're not involved in the mapping/GIS world, you are expected to understand. But yeah, there are standards, and those standards are the one that, I mean, at least in my view, are more important than anything else, just to make sure that they are fulfilled. And by the way, it is not that you may or may not, you have to abide to those standards in order to be able to run quite a few of the base 911 systems.
Thanks again. Are we able to apply for the application-based funding before 2025? No, the program's not been developed. It does not exist as yet. A program guide and application materials will come online in 2025. The thinking is, or the hope is that we'd have it live for the program guide live kind of early winter 2025, and then potentially a funding deadline, application deadline in potentially kind of late spring or maybe fall for that application-based money.
Yeah, and if I can add, Danita, we don't even have a timeline for future phases of NG 911 yet, as far as I understand. So, you know, all we have is the deadline for real-time text. So a lot of that still has to come.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bar. Next question, excuse me. Would legal costs for member municipality to establish a shared service for GIS mapping and public education be eligible? I'm assuming this means shared with the regional district who would establish the service. I would suggest you call us and we could talk through that one with a bit more information. The short answer is that starts to look like sort of routine operating costs. But you know, if you could make the case that it's very specific to the transition to Next Gen 911, maybe. But I think we would need more information to fully understand that one. So if the person who wrote that question would like to send us an email or give us a call, we'd be more than happy to talk through the specifics and then chat with our colleagues at Citizen Services as needed so we could give you an answer. Okay, question about the Islands Trust. Could you elaborate on the funding for Islands Trust? My regional district provides 911 and fire dispatch to Thetis Island and a few smaller islands, which is within the Islands Trust. Other RDs have the same situation. So the Islands Trust is eligible for base funding, so the $45,000. Some of the thinking there is that, you know, like other communities in the province, a lot of tourists, a lot of seasonal folks. So our thinking is no different for the Islands Trust than it is for any of the communities receiving base funding, is that they might want to do local public education, local training within that money. Certainly, I mean, we understand that it's complex. The way that, I mean, 6 months ago, I had no idea how this all worked. And I feel like I've learned an awful lot working with a lot of really helpful folks at some of the secondary PSAPs, but it's complex in terms of how service provision works across the province for the existing 911 system. And we know that complexity is not going to go away as the transition to Next Gen 911 comes into place. So certainly, you know, reach out to, you know, the folks you're working with within the Islands Trust to get a sense of where they're looking to spend money, what makes sense. Certainly, you know, I think collaboration would go a long way for some of the communities where there's sort of overlapping service provision, especially the Islands Trust, who has an overlap with a few regional districts. Question about base funding. Specific to base funding allocation regarding GIS and mapping, would upgrading mobile devices be an eligible expense, or would that be considered operational? So for base funding, we're not looking to do any like tangible capital asset purchasing. So it's not about technological acquisitions or investments. So if by mobile devices you mean upgrading cell phones, or I'm assuming that means cell phones, no, that would not be eligible. So comment here from the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. around who's identified as their primary PSAP. Looks like maybe we got the information wrong. Yeah, certainly give us a call and we're happy to update that.
Yeah, one of the comments, Danita, is that in this process of getting the information, we found out that there is a lot of inconsistencies. So yeah, we're sorry if that was misunderstood at some point, but yeah, this is information that we received from several different sources, and yeah, collaging all those things didn't necessarily mean we had a 100% accurate product. So yeah, sorry if that was a mistake there, but yeah, we can fix that fairly easy.
And I mean, I certainly echo those apologies. It's the appendix that we published in this program guide may be the only place in BC that you can find a list of how 911 services are currently provided in BC to every eligible recipient that we've identified. So it was a bit of an investigative task, and apologies again that we got that wrong, but we're certainly happy to fix it. Oh, nice, easy question. When will the funding agreements be sent out this week? Some may start to go out even as soon as this afternoon. We do have 200 letters to get out the door. So our intent is to start sending them out right away, but over the course of, I think in fairness to my staff, over the next 2 weeks, everyone should expect to see their approval agreement arrive. The approval agreements are being sent out to elected officials and being copied to senior staff, typically CAOs. So those are the mailboxes that the letters, which will go by email, will be arriving in. Okay, another questions here. If we pay an annual fee to ECOM for next generation 911 transition services as a dispatch provider, over and above the initial grant, will those be eligible over year? I'm not sure I understand the question. Yvonne or Bar, do either of you want to?
I think I understand the question, and unfortunately, I think the answer is this is a gray area because, and we will have to defer the question to understanding how ECOM may be charging their kind of members for these kind of things, right? Because again, and we haven't talked about that at all, but ECOM actually received money. So what it means is that they're funding themselves the costs, right? So thinking that they may be funding the costs through the 90 million that they receive, but at the same time they're charging their members a fee for that, doesn't sound right. So I think that if we don't have the name here, anonymous attendee, but if you want to send us like a more specific detail of what this means, we will be able to say yes or no, because we know, for example, the last portion of the funding, the last bucket that we talked about, was basically created because we know that there's some cost that ECOM is not covering, and that's by design. So in that regard, we are aware that there is a model there that didn't fit okay, this is ECOM, this is the rest. So there was kind of an overlap there. But this specific question talks about something different, which is annual fees for transition. That's different. If you're referring to the cost of operating NextGen 911 that it is in place starting 2025, the answer is a clear no, because it doesn't cost, it doesn't cover ongoing costs. But yeah, this is not clear. So again, we don't have your name, but if you want to send us an email and explain a little bit more what the question is, we will be more than happy to address.
Thank you. So back to base funding, trying to understand how much base funding is available for GIS. We do not have in-house GIS and have to hire a consultant, which can be very expensive. So the base funding is $45,000. There are eligible activities identified in the program guide, and it's up to eligible recipients to determine how they spend that $45,000. There's no specific carve out for GIS. Next question. I believe there is an RCMP OCC in Courtney. Was that missed or not eligible? So, oh, Bar, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. I can take that. So there are a number of provincial OCCs that covered that, whereby those costs were covered by the RCMP or other sources. The OCCs that are identified in the funding program are those local governments that have undertaken those responsibilities on their own. So outside of the provincial OCCs and outside of the ECOM dispatch centers in the South Island and the main dispatch center.
So yes, so the four that we're funding are, they're municipal employees working in those facilities. So they're a little bit different.
Yeah, and I should also mention, I think the OCC that's being referenced, I think that's part of the Island District OCC.
Thanks, Bar. Okay, back to mapping and GIS. For mapping and GIS under the local municipalities stream, we are thinking of using some of the funding to hire a short-term employee to help out. What hardware and software costs for them also be covered? So under base funding, there is no hardware or software costs. So no technological acquisitions or investments are eligible under the base funding. We do have some provision in the program guide, if you look on page 4, for incremental applicant staff and administrative costs. So if you do have an incremental cost related to staffing to support your local preparedness for NextGen 911 under the base funding, that would be considered eligible. But there is no tangible capital asset eligibility under base funding. So staff training cost eligibility. Does this include 1, existing salaried staff that have been seconded to manage the transition, and 2, overtime training costs of staff on new technologies, etc. So specific to training, so the first question, existing salaried staff. So we only cover staff costs that are incremental. So if this is something that otherwise they would already be required to do as part of their job description, then no, the grant cannot cover it. But if it's incremental, i.e. it's not something they ever would have had to have done before, or it's a new position created specifically for the transition to 911, then those incremental costs could be considered. And then overtime training costs, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be eligible. That's part of the business continuity and the change management of moving from one system to the next. Are there organizations or third-party companies out there providing educational trainings? If there are, we wouldn't identify them. We don't identify third-party consultants, but I don't know if Yvonne could generally point us in the direction of a resource.
Yeah, the Association of 911 Service Providers, they have a very good list of organizations and consultants and companies that actually do this. So my recommendation will be to ask them if they have any suggestions or if there's something that is already there. I work with them a little bit on some of the NextGen 911 issues, and I know that they have been working on trying to get some specific training and some resources in place for the transition, right? So it's called ABC 911, Association of British Columbia 911 Service Providers. They will be able to provide you with references.
Thank you. A question not related to the funding program, which I think we'll just let the ministry answer. Are there any plans to add communications towers in areas of the province that don't have cell service?
Yeah, I think the second part of the question is actually the answer. This is not part of the funding program, correct? This is not part of the funding program, but I am actually part of the connectivity division within the Ministry of Citizen Services. And we do have other funding programs that actually address these kind of situations. So, so yeah, my recommendation will be if you have specific questions about areas or towers or lack of service in some areas to connect to us in Ministry of Citizen Services Connectivity Division, and we will be able to specifically answer the questions, right? But the short answer to this question is no. This program doesn't cover anything related to deploying new towers or fiber or anything like that.
Thanks again. Yvonne, for you again. Is the province still looking at taking over responsibility for 911 services from regional districts and municipalities?
Well, that is a very complex question. because the answer is we don't know. At this point, there are some initiatives, and this is not only, I mean, I'm representing the province here in a way, because even though I'm part of the Ministry of Citizen Services, I work with PSSG, I work with the Ministry of Forests and some others that are involved in some aspects of 911. And we know how complex it is, and some other provinces have led the way in creating legislation and approaches to this. So we are looking at many different options, but those are, I'm going to say, in the drawing board right now. So we don't have a clear perspective on how this will look like in a couple of years, right? So
thanks again. Next question I will cover. So just it's around the timelines and when the money will be released. So just to reiterate, under the allocation-based funding, which is the first 4 buckets that we discussed, that funding, those approval agreements will start to come out as soon as today, at least this week, and over the next 2 weeks. Every eligible recipient should receive their approval agreement. Once you sign it and return it to us, we'll release 50% of the eligible amount that's been identified in the program guide in the appendix. So, you know, assuming we get them back right away, I'm assuming we'll be releasing payments over August and September. And then applicants are able, or excuse me, recipients are able to then claim the balance of the grant. Recognize that you have 3 years to spend the money. You'll be able to claim the balance of the grant either through submitting an interim report, which would allow us to release progress payments, generally no more than 75% of the total value of the grant. And then the balance would come with the final report. The final report form is not yet posted, but it will be posted very soon. So the funding will be out well in advance of 2025. The application-based program will come online in 2025. Okay, we're down to our last question. So if anybody does have any further questions, or if you are having challenges with the Q&A and want to raise your hand, I would encourage you to do so now. But next question is, can base funding cover consultant costs to help with the transition? Yes, so if you look at page 4 under additional eligible costs, consultant costs are identified as an eligible expenditure. And we do expect for some communities that, you know, the change management aspect of this will be better handled or you know, more easily handled by bringing in consultants. Oh, another question. Oh, 2 more questions. So somebody wanting to connect with Yvonne directly. Yvonne, can we post your email address? Is that
sure. Yeah,
fine?
That's totally fine.
Okay. Vera, can you just pop it into the chat, or Yvonne into the chat, and then Claudia can share it with everybody?
Yeah. I'll do that.
Yeah, no problem.
Great. Thank you. So Jason, to your question, Yvonne's contact information is about to show up, and you can contact him after for your question. Okay, into NINA standards. So this is going to be probably straight over to Yvonne, but here we go. Within the NINA standard, GIS standard docs, there appears to be standards for many different GIS data sets, including service boundaries, address points, and road center lines. Which data sets are a municipal government regional district responsible for? I am assuming the Digital Road Atlas, already a provincial program, is being used for the road data set.
So yes and no. So what happens with these new standards is that they're new. So one of the initiatives that we have within the provincial government is to upgrade some of these standards, and the Digital Road Atlas is one of them, but there are others that are links to some other initiatives that will or are at this point being migrated or changed to the new standards. So yeah, it is. I think it was referred already that we have different responsibilities as it relates to mapping and so on and so forth, and there is not clear 100% agreement so far as to who's responsible for what. And there is a way that the system works today, and replicating that into the standards is the best option that we have today. So if we as a province using GOVC, the digital DRA, are responsible for something, we will continue to be responsible unless there is a change to that responsibility matrix here, right? So, but yeah, the answer is yes. There are lots of new standards or new ways of describing data and so on and so forth, and that's the reason why I didn't want to get into the details before, because it's very technical. But again, that's an area where I'm free to actually engage in conversation if there are questions. Because, by the way, as Danita clearly stated in her presentation, this is one of the most how do we, you use a term that I like, Danita, I don't remember right now, but you say like this is one area that we don't know everything because it's in flux. So we
I said it's a quandary.
Yeah, it's a quandary, exactly. Because we are every day discovering new things, right? So we need to be very careful and not to put boundaries around that. No pun intended, but just making sure that everyone participating has the ability to eventually tap into the resources that we're offering here, because we know that those changes are not going to be necessarily easy to complete.
Another question popped up, but I believe it might actually just be somebody providing response to the previous question, which it says, ultimately, the entity signing the local government service agreement will be responsible for providing the required data sets.
Nancy is from GOVC, so she knows exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy. So I think Douglas Liu is also providing
These are
further clarity.
GOVC people. Yeah, they're excited that we're talking about GIS and mapping things. So thank you. Oh, sorry, Nancy, different Nancy. Okay, yeah, there's two Nancy.
So just for those of you who don't see the chat, just some clarifying points have come up. So the answer is beside roads, site structure, address points for sure. And then another comment that says GOVC will be preparing the DRA to the NENA standard, but we still must pull that data and deliver to TELUS. So a couple more clarifying points there. So that is the last question. So I'm going to do a final call for questions. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to offer my very sincere appreciation for, I think the 130 odd people that were able to join us on a sunny in Victoria summer afternoon, and also to each of our panelists who came on board to help answer questions today. It's very much appreciated. So I'm not seeing any further questions. So I'm going to close the webinar. Please feel free to follow up with either UBCM or Ministry of Citizen Services staff with further questions. And for those of you from local governments or Treaty First Nations, do look forward to receiving your approval agreement by email within the next 2 weeks. Thanks.